Moving over to markets now, and this week, as the UK prepares to break free from the EU, we'll see how U.S. trade may change. Plus, the coronavirus adds another wrinkle to market instability, and the cattle inventory report does something we haven't seen in 6 years. On Tuesday, Mississippi State University livestock economist Josh Maples joined me to discuss it all. I wanted to begin this week with Brexit. So we've got the UK preparing to leave the EU. What are some impacts we could see with U.S. trade?
Yeah, that's right, Troy. This is a big story that's really kind of getting overshadowed by a lot of the other stuff that's happening in international trade. But I think the primary reason that it's getting a little overshadowed is that we still got more questions than we do answers. The backstory is the EU is a really important market, export market for U.S. agriculture. But they've got a complicated, relationship with some pretty significant barriers to ag products. So their strict stance on genetically modified crops or GMO crops, and also their strict stance on hormone use in beef are probably the two biggest examples. So this leaves us with the question, if Britain is no longer in the EU, what does a trade deal look like with just the UK itself? Will we finally be able to export beef that has, hormones have been used in beef to the UK? And I think this is a really important question because if you look at USDA ERS had a report out, and in that report they stated that the UK imports about 48%, nearly half of their food is imported. So it's a big market and a big food market. So the real question is, okay, we know this is a big market. For years they've been part of the EU and has had these strict barriers. Now, moving forward, what do these restrictions and regulations look like if it's just the U.S. and UK negotiating? So these are really important questions. It's important questions for the beef industry, U.S. beef industry, but there's still, at this point, more questions than we have answers. But that's what's currently going on and could be really important for the U.S. beef industry moving forward.
All right, we will wait and see. And moving on, the coronavirus has been in the news a lot. So last week we asked our analyst how the grain markets are being impacted. So this week I'll ask you about the livestock markets. What are the biggest areas of concern?
So really all of ag is kind of impacted by this, and not just all of ag, but just U.S. markets in general, right? I mean, we've seen, this is just a glaring example of how uncertainty can really impact markets. If you look at which ag market in particular is probably, watching this the closest, it's got to be pork. China is a big pork importer right now, and unrelated to the coronavirus is the ASF in China. So they're importing a lot of U.S. pork right now, and so that's the key question: is the virus going to impact demand for U.S. pork in China? And I don't think we've seen really clear evidence. I think the uncertainty piece for sure about whether that's going to happen has weighed on markets. We've seen impacts in the cattle markets as well. So we're seeing impacts right now, but I think at this point the impact is still because of uncertainty about what could happen if this thing continues to spread. So it's definitely something that's worth watching, but it's not one of those things where you can clearly say, this is what it is, because we don't know what it's going to be like over the next weeks or months. So I think it's that uncertainty piece is really kind of sitting on markets right now in a negative way.
Okay, Josh, when it comes to the cattle inventory report that was released back on January 31st, we're seeing inventory down slightly from a year ago. Can you share some details from that and how the market is positioned?
Sure. So the report was pretty well anticipated. Down about half of a percent for all cattle and calves, 94.4 million head of all cattle and calves in the U.S. The important story here is that this is our first decline since 2014. So we've had going on the last 6 years we've been talking about larger cattle numbers, larger calf numbers that are going to turn into beef and hit the beef market. So even though it was well anticipated, it's still a significant story because we've made it past that expansion phase in the cattle industry. Troy, you know as well as anybody, the last 4 or 5 years, all we've been talking about is larger calf numbers, larger cattle on feed numbers, larger beef supplies. So if you look at the beef cow number specifically in the report, down about 1.2%, so down 375,000 head compared to January 1st of 2019. And then if you look at the beef replacement heifers number was down, or beef replacements number was down 2%. Calf crop number for 2019 was just about 1% lower than in 2018. The key piece here and what gets lost in some of these stories is even though we're finally talking about a few lower cattle supplies, 2020 is still going to be a really big beef production year. We're still looking at larger beef supplies in 2020 just because it takes so long for animals to go from calves on the ground to beef that we consume. Market impacts, again, the market I think pretty well anticipated this. The report was well in line with what was expected. So I don't think and I think that's the reason we didn't see a big market impact. It wasn't a big shocker, but it does set the stage for 2020 that we're not going to be talking about these larger supplies moving forward, and that has been a key headwind to prices really since 2015, 2016. So it positions us well moving forward, and I think we're finally not going to be talking about larger supplies that have dominated the headlines for the last few years.